All right. Thank you, everybody. I wish I could be there in person today, but it's a little hard to get across the Atlantic Ocean. My name's Paul Ueda. I'm from The Ohio State University, and today I want to talk to you about characters, Romanization, and anti-colonialism, historical developments of Dai and Vietnamese. So I want to start off with just a little bit of brief historical background about these couple of languages. Where does the history of Taiwanese or Taiyi writing start? So some argue that you could start it in the oracle bones, which is kind of the earliest sources of Chinese characters that we have in approximately 1200 BCE. But some would also argue that these characters would have started with the Tale of the Lychee Mirror in 1566, which is the earliest operatic script that we have today that shows writing specifically representing Southern men, which is the historical predecessor of Daigi. Something that's kind of important in culturally speaking is this process of 警晰自治, or respecting the characters and the paper that they are written on. So culturally speaking, papers with writing on them were very highly revered within Chinese society. And so a lot of the Daigi writing during this time would have been very kind of seen as crass or as lower class activities. However, that's not to say it did not exist. Starting in the 15 to 1600s, specifically in Taiwan, we started to see the promotion of songbooks. And these songbooks were typically kind of like local songs or songs for the churches. And they were recorded in these books to help performers to memorize them and remember them. But I do want to emphasize again that these were considered lowbrow pieces of literature. During this same time, Western missionaries started to come to the region, and they created a romanization system known as Beiweiji, which was using the Latin alphabet to represent the language. This Latin alphabet eventually spread beyond the missionary community and was part of the Romanized Taiwanese movement, which occurred during the Japanese colonial period from 1895 to 1945. Just as a very quick show, during this time, the writing system was considered to be a very political act. Cai Peihuo was one of the Taiwanese individuals who lived during the Japanese colonial period, and he was a big proponent of this Romanization system, and he actively petitioned the Japanese government in order to officially adopt this Romanized system. And it wasn't just for the language. He argued that it was specifically for the political movement. He saw that giving the Taiwanese people a way to write their own language was going to be a way to progress the ability of the Taiwanese people to participate on the world stage. So he saw the inherent relationship between the writing and the socio-political. Since 1945, there's been some other developments with Taigi. It was suppressed during the Japanese Kominka or nationalism movement in the 1930s. And then after 1945 and 1949, when the nationalist Chinese government moved to the island of Taiwan, Taigi was similarly repressed. So in the 1980s, you had the Return Our Mother Tongue movement, in which local language activists petitioned the nationalist government to allow for the usage of these natural or of these mother tongues, including Taigi, as well as some of the other indigenous languages of the islands. Since the democratization of Taiwan in the late 1990s, with the first democratic election in 2000, there's been several step forwards. So in 2001, the government required that all local schools teach the local languages, but this was still very limited. This was talking about maybe 40 minutes a week, hardly enough to acquire a whole language. In 2006 and 2009, the Taiwanese government started to officially promote some orthographic standards, coming out with a romanization system in 2006 and then official Chinese characters in 2009. And this culminated in 2011 with the Taiwanese Southern Commonly Used Words Dictionary being published online. To kind of drive home how marginalized this language has been, despite being the most spoken language on the island up until the 1960s, it was never the official language of the island, not until 2019 with the development of National Languages Act, which officially established it alongside Hakka and the indigenous languages as one of the national languages. So my past research has kind of looked at some of the variation that still exists in Taiwanese writing. Despite the government providing some official standards, these standards are still very much so contested, and individuals do not willingly use them. I divided the variation I saw into three different camps, three different frameworks based off of socio-political mentalities. So the first one of these is the modernist camp, which is represented by those governmental standards, and they are focused on creating a orthography for the shared future of Taiwanese on the island, regardless of their identity as Chinese or Taiwanese. This is in contrast to the etymologist camp, who saw the importance of focusing on the original etymological characters. So these individuals were looking at classical Chinese sources dating back hundreds of years or even millennia in order to reconstruct the original quote unquote characters. And then finally, the localist camp, which is those who focus specifically on the orthographic practice of individuals in Taiwan. So they don't necessarily care what is etymologically correct. They care about what's been used on the island. And the focus here is on establishing Taiwanese as an independent entity separate from Mandarin. And today I want to look more on this localist camp specifically. This localist camp tends to be overtly political. They bring in a lot of discussion of the Nationalist Party colonization, and a lot of their thoughts are kind of in response to that. It's related to this Benshengren, or kind of a native island or ethno-identity group who rejects anything Chinese on the island. And while some support the usage of these Chinese characters, there's more momentum in this group for the exclusive usage of Beiweiji, which is that missionary romanization system. However, these efforts so far have not been successful. And to kind of understand why they haven't been successful, I looked at a very similar case, and that is the case of Vietnamese in Vietnam. So, just as a very brief overview, Vietnam used to be colonized by the Chinese for approximately a millennium. During this time period, they imported the usage of Chinese characters and would later adapt them for Vietnamese, specifically with Tu Nom. And then in 1861, they were officially colonized by the French, and we saw a lot of movements to abandon the usage of Chinese and Vietnamese in favor of French. And then post 1945, they've had national independence. And now, as you know, today, they have their own writing system, which is the Latin alphabet with a diacritic system. So I'm going to move beyond this. One thing that I want to bring up is that in 1624, just like we saw in Daigi, missionaries were the ones who originally created a romanization system for the language. It's typically attributed to the French Jesuit Alexandre de Rhodes. However, this is a little bit disputed, even though at this time it was mainly used for the purposes of proselytizing the Vietnamese population. I'm going to move forward here. In the era of French colonialism, similar to Taigi, we saw the usage of orthography being tied to specific socio-political groups. In 1907, the Tonkin Free School adapted that romanization system and spread the idea of Quoc Nu, or these national characters, and this was done as a anti-colonial, promoting the Vietnamese identity. And there was a very famous lecture during this time period that said Vietnam cannot be saved without getting rid of Chinese characters and adopting that romanization. So over the course of the colonial period, there was different struggles in between the French and Vietnamese in Romanization, as well as in Chinese characters. By the end of the colonial period, that Quoc Ngu, the Romanization system, had won out over the characters and just pure Chinese, but still only about 20% of the population was literate. Um, and this was a central focus of the national independence period, in which you had Ho Chi Minh, who launched a literacy campaign. And there was massive jumps in literacy from 20% in 1945 to 70% in 1953. And that Vietnamese writing was used as a tool for nationalism. So I know that was very quickly. I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of background, but I would like to discuss a couple of activists, kind of as a small case study selected specifically for today. These activists are YouTubers who aim to promote the usage of Taigi, so they're actively targeting the younger generation of Taiwan. I transcribed some of their videos into a document, and I did a little bit of qualitative review of their language attitudes that they expressed. So the first one is Ah Hua. He is very clearly a member of that localist camp, and he makes a lot of videos related to the sociopolitical questions in the usage of Daigi. He promotes that everybody should use that romanization system, Beiweiji, even though in his videos he uses the mixed style script for accessibility. He has really promoted this, I am a Taiwanese person, I speak the Taigi language mentality, which is kind of a counterculture mentality in Taiwan, arguing that uh, despite the overwhelming presence of Mandarin, if you want to call yourself a Taiwanese individual, you need to speak the Taiwanese language. Similarly, I have there's the Tainan little sister teaches you to speak Taigi, and she uses the MOE characters in her videos, but she promotes the Beiweiji, the romanization system, and the localist ideologies. And her videos specifically are more language learning, and they're meant to help Mandarin monolinguals learn Taigi. And she specifically does not recommend the usage of characters in studying Taigi, saying that romanization is a better tool. Why do they suggest it? Well, we can kind of understand this by a comparative analysis of the case of Taigi and Vietnamese. So, how were these processes similar? The promotion of romanization. Romanization was argued to make the language fit in or easier to transfer knowledge. So, Taylor, during the French Civil Rule, one of the administrators in Vietnam argued that without doubt, the replacement of Chinese or Annamite characters by Latin characters by Quoc Ngu is desirable from the point of view of our influence. Without, the diffusion of French would offer great conveniences, referring to the overall civilization of the people. This was also kind of seen in Taiwan. During the Japanese period, katakana was used by the Japanese government with the end goal of having all of the population switch to Japanese, which they saw as a civilizing mission. Uh, Beiweiji matches that phonographic system used by other languages worldwide, talking about like English and French and so on. And this relationship was specifically called out. The Talamoya, the little sister, argues that using POJ makes it easier to learn English. If you learn POJ, you eventually can be able to learn English. However, the romanization system wasn't only for practical purposes, it was seen as a tool of revitalization and for creation of national pride. So, in both of these cases of both Thai and Vietnamese, historically speaking, there's been a cultural assumption of inferiority. But in both cases, activists had to argue against the assumption that that local language was not advanced enough, was not civilized enough to be able to be used in kind of national or international context. It wasn't worthy of talking about science and so on and so forth. This is something that is still ongoing in the case of Taigi. And then finally, it was to remove the influence of the colonizer. So Ahua, in discussing if Taiwanese should be considered Southern men, which is a alternative term that some linguists prefer to use. He argues that we know the question of Dai language, actually Southern Min, is only for those who speak Dai to decide together. Those who do not speak Dai do not have the place to join in the conversation about this question. For him, the usage of Southern Min as this one term is a usage by foreign linguists, by those who are supporting some other political measures, to say that, oh, Taigi is part of this broader language family. They don't actually speak the language. They don't have a place to argue what its classification should actually be. And he sees this as a colonial process. This was similar in Vietnamese. In Vietnamese, Lee Kake had a section on how to use the Romanized script in order to deal with the scientific lexical gap. You could either import European words or borrow Chinese terms or create new ones. And of these processes, the third is the most preferable in order to create words that have a sense of national identity with them. And I was conducting field interviews with people in Taiwan over the summer, and several people mentioned the same mindset. They were like, I can't use Taigi in my specialty in school because there's no words for it. I can't, there's no way to talk about what I'm doing in Taigi, but yet they were not sure how they felt about creating new words in order to be able to talk about it. But importantly, also, how do they differ? Who was the colonizer and the colonized? In the case of Vietnam, there were marginal French left in Vietnam. So after the colonial period, there was a more room for a radical revolution. Whereas in Taiwan, since there was such a immigration of the Chinese populace after the Civil War, it was a more gradual, a more pluralist nation. And this sees itself in that perceived cultural connection to China. Vietnam has always remained on the periphery of the Sinosphere, whereas Taiwan is always center or the first level, causing it to be much harder to fully break away from that political usage of the characters. So, in conclusion, the situation in colonial Vietnam and Taiwan had many similarities that could have implied shared future directions. They had that previous cultural history with China. They had that desire by the colonial government to fully replace the language, and they argued for the creation of Romanization tools by missionaries that was eventually co-opted by the nationalists for that national identity. But there's key differences that have led to the divergent paths, and that's their relationship with the colonizer, the state of literacy post-colonization, and also the degree of social change post-colonization. Vietnam had a radical revolution, whereas Taiwan was more gradual. And so, nonetheless, the case of Vietnamese could serve as an example for the Romanized Taiwanese proponents to follow. It could argue that you need to create that marked shift in national identity in order to adopt this alternative Romanization scheme. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Yes.
Do all the people that these YouTube videos belong to the localist group, the localist camp?
Yes, for the ones I analyzed specifically for today's talk, they belong to localist camp. Not all YouTubers do, but I was focusing specifically on the localist one today.
Yes. One domain where you might find a great degree of localism, I think, in Sinitic, is in sentence final particles.
Mm.
Find some interesting trends in the way that those are orthographically represented for sake of localization.
Right. I think that's a great suggestion. I've had some participants who have transcribed sentences from Taigi before, and I noticed that a lot of those who tended to be more Mandarinized in the way that they would represent the language had a more Mandarin use of sentence final particles, which are more common in Mandarin than in Taigi. So I think that's a very good way to maybe operationalize degree of Mandarinization.